Prince Alexander stood at the tall window of Rosewood Castle, watching raindrops race down the glass. At 8 years old, he had learned that words could be dangerous things. In a world where every sentence he spoke was analyzed, recorded, and sometimes twisted, silence had become his closest friend. The young prince had not always been this way. Stories from the castle staff told of a chattering boy who once filled the halls with laughter and endless questions. But that was before the incident that changed everything. 2 years ago, during a public ceremony, young Alexander had made an innocent comment about wanting to help the hungry people he saw outside the castle gates. His words were twisted by the press and political enemies, creating a scandal that rocked the kingdom for months. Since that day, Alexander had chosen silence as his shield. He communicated through gentle nods, soft smiles, and expressive eyes that seemed far too wise for someone his age. The royal tutors worried about his development, but those closest to the prince understood that his silence was not empty. It was full of careful observation and deep thought. Captain Marcus Thornfield had been assigned as Alexander's personal guard 6 months ago. A man of 35 years, Marcus came from a military family that had served the crown for generations. His father had protected the previous king, and his grandfather before that. Being chosen to guard the young prince was the highest honor of his career, but it was also the most challenging assignment he had ever received. Marcus was a man of action and words. He believed in direct communication, clear orders, and straightforward solutions. The silence of Prince Alexander frustrated him deeply. How could he properly protect someone who would not tell him what they were thinking or feeling? How could he anticipate the prince's needs when the boy refused to express them? Every morning, Marcus would arrive at the prince's chambers with a formal greeting and a rundown of the day's schedule. Alexander would listen politely, nod at appropriate moments, and then go about his day without saying a single word. During meals, Marcus would attempt conversation about safe topics, the weather, the castle's history, interesting facts about the kingdom. The prince would acknowledge these efforts with small gestures but never responded verbally. The other guards often joked about Marcus's assignment. They called it the silent treatment, and suggested that guarding a quiet child was the easiest job in the castle. But Marcus knew better. Behind Alexander's silence was a complexity that made his job incredibly difficult. The prince was unpredictable in his quietness. He might suddenly decide to explore a part of the castle that was off limits, or he might sit perfectly still for hours, lost in thoughts that Marcus could not access. One particular morning brought an unusual challenge. The royal family was preparing for the annual harvest festival, a tradition where the castle opened its doors to the public. Security was always tight during these events, but this year there were additional concerns. Intelligence reports suggested that protesters might attempt to disrupt the celebration, and Marcus had been ordered to keep Prince Alexander away from any potential trouble. As the morning progressed, Alexander seemed more restless than usual. He moved from window to window, watching the preparations in the courtyard below. Vendors were setting up colorful stalls, musicians were tuning their instruments, and families from the surrounding villages were beginning to arrive. The prince's eyes followed every detail of the scene, but his face remained as unreadable as always. Marcus tried to engage him in conversation about the festival. "Your Highness, the kitchen staff tells me they have prepared your favorite pastries for today's celebration. Perhaps we could visit the main hall later to see the decorations?" Alexander turned from the window and looked at Marcus with those penetrating eyes, then simply walked to his desk and began drawing. The drawing caught Marcus's attention. It was not the typical sketch of a child. It was detailed and thoughtful. Alexander had drawn the view from his window, but he had added something that was not really there. In his picture, he had drawn himself standing among the people in the courtyard, not separated from them by stone walls and royal protocol. Marcus studied the drawing carefully. For the first time, he felt he was beginning to understand something important about the prince. The boy's silence was not just protection from the dangers of speaking. It was also a barrier that kept him isolated from the world he longed to be part of. As the festival activities grew louder below, Alexander's restlessness increased. He moved to different windows, always watching the people outside. Marcus noticed how the prince's fingers traced patterns on the glass, as if he were trying to reach through the barrier that separated him from the celebration. The afternoon brought a moment that would change everything between them. While walking through the castle's portrait gallery, they encountered Sarah, a young kitchen maid who was new to the castle staff. She was crying quietly as she tried to clean a valuable vase that she had accidentally cracked. Marcus was prepared to handle the situation in the standard way. Report the incident to the head of staff and arrange for the vase to be repaired or replaced. But Prince Alexander surprised him by approaching the frightened girl directly. Without saying a word, the prince knelt beside Sarah and gently touched the cracked vase. He examined it carefully, then looked up at the girl with such compassion that her tears began to slow. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of gold leaf, a craft supply from his art lessons. He carefully placed it over the crack in the vase, creating a beautiful golden line that made the damage look like an intentional decoration. Sarah's face lit up with amazement and gratitude. She whispered her thanks to the prince, who simply smiled and nodded before standing to continue his walk. The entire interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes, but Marcus felt as though he had witnessed something profound. For the first time since becoming Alexander's guard, Marcus began to understand that the prince's communication was not limited by his lack of words. In that brief moment with Sarah, Alexander had communicated more kindness and understanding than many people manage with lengthy speeches. As evening approached and the festival continued in the courtyard below, Marcus found himself looking at Prince Alexander with new eyes. The boy's silence was not a weakness or a problem to be solved. It was a different kind of strength that allowed him to observe, understand, and respond to the world in ways that words could not capture. That night, as Marcus completed his security reports, he found himself writing something unusual. Instead of noting the prince's lack of verbal communication as a concern, he wrote about Alexander's remarkable ability to connect with people through actions and presence. For the first time in months, Marcus felt that he was beginning to understand the boy he was sworn to protect. The days following the harvest festival brought a noticeable change in the dynamic between Prince Alexander and Captain Marcus Thornfield. Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the prince's subtle communications. The way Alexander's posture shifted when he was interested in something, how his eyes lingered on details that others might miss, and the gentle way he moved through the world, as if every step was considered. Prince Alexander, for his part, seemed to sense this change in his guardian. While he remained silent, there was a new quality to their interactions. The prince began to include Marcus more deliberately in his silent observations, turning to catch the guard's eye when something particularly interesting caught his attention, or positioning himself so that Marcus could see what he was looking at. One crisp autumn morning brought news that would test their growing understanding. King Ferdinand, Alexander's father, announced that a delegation from the neighboring kingdom of Valdris would be arriving for important trade negotiations. The delegation would include Prince Eric of Valdris, who was known throughout the region for his exceptional skill in combat and his loud, boisterous personality. The visit was politically crucial, but it presented unique challenges for Alexander. Prince Eric was famous for his love of verbal sparring and debate. He enjoyed testing others through conversation and was known to become impatient with those who could not match his quick wit and rapid speech. The royal advisors were concerned about how the meeting between the two princes would unfold. Marcus received detailed briefings about the visiting delegation and their security requirements. Prince Eric traveled with his own guard, Commander Stefan Volkov, a stern man with a reputation for military precision and little tolerance for what he considered weakness. The prospect of managing both princes and their different styles concerned Marcus greatly. Alexander seemed aware of the approaching visit and its implications. Marcus noticed the prince spending more time in the castle's library, carefully studying books about Valdris culture and history. The boy would trace his finger along maps of the neighboring kingdom and study portraits of its royal family. His preparation was thorough and silent, like everything else he did. The morning of the delegation's arrival, Marcus dressed in his finest uniform and ensured that every aspect of Alexander's security was perfect. The prince appeared calm, wearing the formal attire appropriate for greeting foreign royalty. But Marcus could see a new tension in the boy's shoulders. Prince Eric arrived like a storm. He bounded from his carriage with energy that seemed to fill the entire courtyard. At 12 years old, he was notably older than Alexander, with the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His voice carried clearly across the stone courtyard as he greeted the welcoming party with enthusiasm and jokes that made the adults laugh. Commander Volkov followed his prince with military precision, his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. Marcus noticed how the commander's gaze lingered disapprovingly on various aspects of Rosewood Castle's security arrangements. It was clear that Volkov believed his own methods were superior. The formal introductions took place in the Great Hall. King Ferdinand presented Prince Alexander to the visiting delegation with words of welcome and hope for friendship between their kingdoms. Prince Eric responded with a flowing speech about honor, alliance, and the joy of meeting new friends. When it came time for Alexander to respond, the hall fell silent. Alexander stepped forward with quiet dignity. He bowed deeply to Prince Eric, a gesture that conveyed respect and welcome without need for words. Then, in a move that surprised everyone present, he approached Eric and offered him a small gift, a beautifully carved wooden horse that Alexander had crafted himself in his woodworking lessons. Prince Eric accepted the gift with genuine surprise and pleasure. He examined the intricate carving with obvious appreciation, running his fingers over the smooth wood and detailed mane. For a moment, his usual flood of words seemed to pause as he truly looked at what Alexander had created. "This is remarkable work," Eric said, his voice softer than it had been since his arrival. "Did you make this yourself?" Alexander nodded with a small smile. Eric turned the horse over in his hands, admiring every angle. "The detail is incredible. You must show me how you achieved this texture in the mane." What followed was an unexpected interaction. Prince Eric, despite his reputation for loving verbal conversation, found himself drawn into Alexander's world of silent communication. Alexander led Eric to the workshop where he had carved the horse, showing him the tools and techniques through demonstration rather than explanation. Marcus watched this unusual friendship develop with fascination. Eric, who was accustomed to dominating conversations, discovered the pleasure of careful observation. Alexander, who had been isolated by his silence, found someone willing to learn his language of gestures and shared activities. However, not everyone appreciated this growing connection. Commander Volkov made his displeasure clear to Marcus during a private conversation in the castle's armory. "Your prince's silence is concerning," Volkov stated bluntly. "Prince Eric is wasting valuable time trying to accommodate this quirk. In Valdris, we believe that future leaders must be strong communicators. Silence in a prince suggests weakness that enemies will exploit." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the criticism. "Prince Alexander communicates very effectively, Commander. Perhaps the methods are different, but the substance is clear to those who pay attention." Volkov's laugh was harsh. "Pretty words, Captain, but the world is not a gentle place. Enemies will not stop to interpret gestures and meaningful looks. A prince who cannot defend himself with words cannot defend his kingdom with actions." The conversation troubled Marcus more than he cared to admit. While he had grown to appreciate Alexander's unique form of communication, Volkov's words echoed concerns that others in the court had whispered. Was Alexander's silence truly a strength, or was Marcus simply making excuses for a limitation that could prove dangerous? These doubts grew when an incident occurred during the delegation's third day at the castle. Prince Eric had convinced Alexander to join him for sword practice in the training yard. The two boys were working through basic forms under the supervision of the weapons master when a group of visiting nobles arrived to observe. Among the observers was Lord Cassius of Valdris, a man known for his sharp tongue and political ambitions. As the boys practiced, Lord Cassius began making comments that grew increasingly pointed. "Interesting technique," he said, as Alexander executed a careful defensive move. "Rather passive, wouldn't you say? In our kingdom, princes learn to attack decisively." Eric, loyal to his new friend, tried to redirect the conversation. "Alexander shows excellent control and precision, Lord Cassius. These are valuable skills in combat." But Lord Cassius was not easily deterred. "Control and precision are certainly important," he agreed, his tone suggesting otherwise. But what happens when words fail? And action is required. A leader must be able to inspire troops with rallying cries, negotiate with enemies through verbal strength, command respect through the power of speech. Alexander continued his practice, but Marcus could see the boy's movements becoming more careful, more withdrawn. The criticism was having an effect, even though Alexander did not respond to it directly. Perhaps, Lord Cassius continued, the young prince would benefit from spending time in Valdris, where he could learn to find his voice. Silence may seem peaceful, but in the real world, it is often mistaken for submission. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eric looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to defend his friend but unsure how to counter such direct criticism. Alexander lowered his practice sword and stood very still, his face showing no emotion but his posture revealing the impact of the harsh words. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. Every instinct told him to intervene, to defend the prince he had grown to understand and respect. But protocol demanded that he remain silent unless directly addressed or unless Alexander's safety was at immediate risk. Alexander looked across the training yard, his eyes finding Marcus among the observers. In that look, Marcus saw something that surprised him. Not hurt or anger at Lord Cassius's words, but a question. The prince was asking, without words, what Marcus truly thought. Was Lord Cassius right? Was Alexander's silence a weakness that made him unfit to lead? The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken communication that had become their specialty. Marcus realized that his response to this silent question would define not only their relationship, but also Alexander's understanding of his own worth. In that crucial moment, Marcus made a choice that would change everything. Instead of offering the reassurance that Alexander might have expected, Marcus did something unprecedented. He stepped forward, approaching the prince with the same respect he would show to any future king. Then, in front of all the observers, Marcus knelt before Prince Alexander and spoke words that would echo through the castle for years to come. The training yard fell completely silent as Captain Marcus Thornfield knelt before Prince Alexander. Every observer, from the visiting nobles to the castle staff, watched with surprise as the respected guard captain prepared to speak. Alexander's eyes widened slightly, but he remained perfectly still, waiting to hear what Marcus would say. "Your Highness," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "In the 6 months I have served as your guardian, you have taught me more about true leadership than I learned in 20 years of military service." Lord Cassius scoffed, but Marcus continued without acknowledging the interruption. "I have watched you communicate with such clarity that words become unnecessary. I have seen you show compassion to a frightened servant, creativity in solving problems, and wisdom in choosing when to act and when to observe." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "A leader who speaks without thinking creates chaos. A leader who acts without understanding causes harm. But a leader who observes, understands, and responds with thoughtful action, such a leader builds kingdoms that endure." Prince Eric stepped closer, his face showing growing understanding and admiration. Even Commander Volkov watched with interest, though his expression remained skeptical. "Lord Cassius speaks of voice and verbal strength," Marcus continued, "but I have learned that the most powerful communication comes from understanding others so deeply that words become merely decoration. Your Highness does not need to fill silence with empty noise, because your silence is full of meaning." Alexander's composure finally cracked slightly. The boy's eyes showed a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been relief. For so long, he had wondered if his chosen silence made him weak. To hear his guardian, a man he had come to respect greatly, declare his approach a strength rather than a limitation, was profoundly meaningful. Marcus rose from his kneel and faced Lord Cassius directly. "You suggest that silence indicates submission, my lord. But I would argue that it often indicates the opposite. It takes great strength to remain quiet when others expect you to speak. It requires confidence to communicate through actions when others demand words." Lord Cassius's face reddened with indignation. "Pretty speeches, Captain. But the real world requires more than philosophical theories. How would your silent prince handle a crisis that demands immediate verbal commands? How would he negotiate with enemies who seek to test his resolve through aggressive questioning? Before Marcus could respond, something unexpected happened. Prince Alexander stepped forward, not to speak, but to act. He walked to the weapons rack and selected a different practice sword, one that was heavier and more challenging than the one he had been using. Then he returned to the center of the training area and assumed a ready stance. The message was clear to everyone present. Alexander was accepting Lord Cassius's challenge. Not with words, but through demonstration. He was showing that true strength could be proven through action rather than declaration. Eric immediately understood and moved to join his friend. An excellent idea, the older prince announced. Actions do speak louder than words. Shall we show these observers what kind of leaders we might become? What followed was not a violent confrontation, but a beautiful demonstration of skill, control, and partnership. Alexander and Eric moved through an intricate sparring sequence that showcased not only their individual abilities but their capacity to work together. Alexander's precise, thoughtful movements complemented Eric's bold, dynamic style perfectly. As they practiced, something remarkable happened. The two princes began to communicate entirely through their sword work, adjusting their techniques, responding to each other's moves, and creating a flowing conversation that needed no words. Eric, who loved verbal sparring, discovered the joy of this silent dialogue. Alexander, who had felt isolated by his quietness, experienced the pleasure of being completely understood by someone who had learned his language. The observers watched in growing amazement as the demonstration continued. It became clear that Alexander's silence was not a limitation but a different kind of strength, one that allowed him to read his partner's intentions perfectly and respond with incredible precision. Commander Volkov, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself nodding with professional appreciation. Remarkable situational awareness, he murmured to Marcus. The boy reads movement like a veteran soldier reads a battlefield. When the demonstration concluded, Alexander and Eric stood together, both breathing slightly hard but smiling broadly. The friendship that had developed over the past few days had deepened into something that transcended the differences in their communication styles. Lord Cassius, faced with such an obvious display of competence and leadership, found himself without ready criticism. He muttered something about unconventional methods and withdrew from the conversation, clearly uncomfortable with having his assumptions challenged so effectively. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus approached Prince Alexander with genuine pride. Your Highness, that was masterfully handled. You proved your point without needing to argue it. Alexander looked up at his guardian and, for the first time since Marcus had known him, the prince made a gesture that was both unexpected and deeply moving. Alexander reached out and touched Marcus's hand briefly, a simple contact that conveyed gratitude, understanding, and affection more clearly than any words could have managed. But the day held one more surprise that would test everything both Alexander and Marcus had learned about each other. That evening, as the castle prepared for a formal dinner to honor the visiting delegation, Marcus received troubling news. His younger brother David, who served as a junior guard in the castle, had been accused of stealing gold coins from the treasury. The evidence seemed clear. The coins had been found hidden in David's quarters, and several witnesses reported seeing him near the treasury at unusual times. Marcus was devastated. His family's honor, built over generations of faithful service, seemed destroyed in an instant. Protocol demanded that he arrest his own brother and present him for royal judgment. The shame and heartbreak of the situation threatened to overwhelm him completely. Marcus sat alone in his quarters, staring at the official accusation documents and trying to comprehend how his brother could have betrayed everything their family stood for. David had always been impulsive and sometimes careless, but Marcus had never imagined him capable of theft. A soft knock at his door interrupted his anguished thoughts. Marcus opened it to find Prince Alexander standing in the hallway, still dressed in his formal dinner attire. The boy's presence was unexpected. Dinner was still in progress, and Alexander should have been attending the official functions. Without speaking, Alexander entered Marcus's quarters and looked around. taking in the scattered documents and Marcus's obvious distress. The prince's perceptive eyes quickly assessed the situation, even though Marcus had said nothing about the crisis. Alexander approached Marcus's desk and studied the accusation documents carefully. His finger traced along the writing, and his face showed deep concentration as he absorbed the details of the charges against David Thornfield. Then, in a gesture that surprised Marcus completely, Alexander gathered the documents and indicated that Marcus should follow him. The prince led his guardian through the castle corridors, moving with purpose toward an area that Marcus rarely visited, the small chambers where junior staff lived. They stopped outside David's room, which had been sealed after the discovery of the stolen coins. Alexander produced a key from his pocket. Apparently, even junior guards' quarters were not locked against the prince. Inside the modest room, Alexander began a careful examination that showed his remarkable powers of observation. Marcus watched in amazement as the prince methodically studied every detail of his brother's living space. Alexander examined the hiding place where the coins had been found, tested the security of the window, and even studied the pattern of dust on the furniture. After several minutes of silent investigation, Alexander made a discovery that changed everything. Behind David's washstand, he found something that the initial searchers had missed: a small hole in the wall that connected to the neighboring room. Alexander carefully examined this opening and then gestured for Marcus to look as well. Through the hole, they could see into the next chamber, which belonged to Henrik the stable master. More importantly, they could see Henrik himself, frantically searching through his belongings with obvious panic. As they watched, Henrik discovered a loose floorboard and pulled out several more gold coins, clearly more of the missing treasury money. The truth became clear instantly. Henrik had been the real thief. But when suspicion began to fall on him, he had planted evidence in David's room by pushing the stolen coins through the wall opening. David was innocent, but he had been perfectly framed by someone who knew his routines and had access to his quarters. Alexander and Marcus exchanged a long look of understanding. The prince had solved the mystery that could have destroyed Marcus's family, and he had done it through careful observation and investigation rather than interrogation or accusations. But Alexander was not finished. Instead of immediately exposing Henrik, the prince made a choice that revealed the depth of his character. He approached Henrik's door and knocked gently. When the panicked stable master opened it, Alexander stood there with quiet dignity, holding the original stolen coins that had been planted in David's room. Henrik's face went white with terror and guilt. In that moment, faced with the silent presence of the prince who clearly knew the truth, Henrik broke down completely. He fell to his knees and confessed everything: his gambling debts, his desperate theft from the treasury, and his cowardly decision to frame an innocent man to save himself. Alexander listened to the full confession with compassion rather than anger. When Henrik finished speaking, the prince helped him to his feet and gestured toward the door. The message was clear but not harsh. Henrik needed to confess publicly and face the consequences of his actions. But Alexander would not humiliate him or treat him cruelly. As they walked together toward the great hall where the formal dinner continued, Marcus felt his understanding of Prince Alexander reach a new depth. The boy had not only saved David from unjust punishment and restored the Thornfield family honor, he had shown mercy and dignity to the actual criminal as well. In that moment, Marcus realized that Prince Alexander's greatest strength was not his silence itself, but what that silence allowed him to develop: an extraordinary ability to observe, understand, and respond to others with perfect wisdom and compassion. When they reached the great hall, Alexander made his final choice. Rather than interrupting the formal dinner with accusations and drama, he quietly approached his father and whispered the first words Marcus had ever heard him speak aloud. A brief, private explanation that allowed Henrik to confess with dignity and David to be cleared without public spectacle. As the evening concluded and justice was quietly served, Marcus knelt once more before Prince Alexander. This time not for the benefit of observers, but from his own sincere gratitude and recognition. "Your Highness," he said softly, "you have shown me that true leadership is not about commanding others, but about understanding them so completely that you can help them find their own path to truth and honor. Prince Alexander placed his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. And in that gentle touch, Marcus felt the quiet strength that would one day make this silent boy a great king. The prince's communication through silence had not only solved a crisis, but had revealed a depth of character that would serve the kingdom well. From that day forward, Marcus never again questioned the power of Prince Alexander's chosen silence. Instead, he devoted himself to learning the language of observation, compassion, and thoughtful action that the young prince spoke so fluently. Their bond, forged through understanding rather than words, became the foundation of a trust that would last throughout Alexander's eventual reign and beyond.